Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. When my grandmother died in Salem, Oregon, she left me her Victorian house built in 1947. I was broke, fresh out of college, and the inheritance seemed like a blessing. The only catch was that while I renovated the main floors, I'd have to live in the converted attic where she'd stored decades of family belongings. The first thing that hit me when I climbed those narrow stairs was the smell. Musty paper, old fabric, and something else I couldn't identify. Lavender, maybe? Grandmother's perfume still lingering after 3 months since her passing. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Antique furniture covered in white sheets looked like ghosts in the dim light filtering through the single dormer window. But what dominated the space were the photographs. Dozens of shoe boxes filled with family pictures dating back to the 1920s. Maybe earlier. I spent my first week sorting through them, trying to identify relatives I'd never met. My great-great-grandfather in his military uniform, cousins at Christmas dinners, birthday parties, weddings, summer picnics, normal family memories preserved in fading black and white. Then I found the box labeled Attic Parties, 1960s in my grandmother's careful handwriting. The photos showed the same space I was living in, but transformed. String lights hung from the rafters. People in 60s clothing dancing, laughing, holding drinks. Family gatherings that must have happened when my grandmother was young, before she moved the parties downstairs. I recognized some faces. My grandfather when he still had hair, my grandmother's sisters who'd passed away years ago. But in every single photograph, there was someone I didn't recognize. A figure standing in the corner behind everyone else, always partially hidden by shadows or other people, never quite in focus. Sometimes just a shoulder and part of a face. Sometimes a silhouette against the window, but always there, in every photo from those attic parties. I called my Aunt Linda, the family historian. She'd grown up in that house, would have been at those parties. "Oh, honey, I remember those gatherings," she said. "But I can't think of anyone who would always be standing alone like that. Your grandmother was social. Everyone mingled, danced, had fun. No one just lurked." That night I arranged all the attic photos in chronological order across my makeshift bed. The mysterious figure was definitely moving closer to the camera over time. In the earliest photos from 1962, they were barely visible against the far wall. By 1968, they were standing right behind the main group. But that wasn't the strangest part. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of papers. Rustling. The photographs I'd carefully arranged were scattered across the floor as if someone had walked through them. When I gathered them up, my hands shaking, I realized they were now organized differently. By the position of the figure, not by date. And there was one more photo I hadn't seen before. It showed me, asleep in my makeshift bed in the attic, taken from the angle of someone standing right where that corner figure always positioned themselves. Behind my sleeping form, barely visible in the grainy darkness, was a silhouette watching me. I burned all the photographs the next morning in the backyard fire pit. Watched decades of family memories turn to ash and smoke. The smell of burning chemicals made my eyes water, but I felt lighter somehow. Relieved. When I went back upstairs that evening, there was a single photograph on my pillow. It showed me that morning, kneeling by the fire pit, feeding photos to the flames. In the attic window above, clearly visible this time, was the figure, watching me destroy the evidence of its existence. I never found out who developed that final photograph. By my 3rd month in the attic, I'd gotten used to the house settling at night. Old Victorian homes are full of sounds, creaking floorboards, pipes expanding and contracting, wind whistling through gaps in the siding, but there was one sound that didn't fit the pattern. Every night at exactly 2:47 a.m., I'd hear knocking from inside the walls. Not random settling noises, but deliberate knocking with a specific rhythm. 3 knocks, pause. 2 knocks, pause. 1 knock. Then silence until the next night. At first, I thought it might be pipes or maybe a trapped animal, but the timing was too precise, too consistent, and it always came from the same section of wall near the head of my bed. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I started keeping a journal, documenting the exact times and patterns. Always 2:47 a.m., always the same sequence. 3, 2, 1, then nothing. One particularly sleepless night in December, I decided to research the house's history at the Salem Public Library. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, helped me dig through old records and newspaper archives. That's when I found the obituary. Thomas James Kellerman, beloved brother and son, passed away in his sleep December 15th, 1953, in the family home on Maple Street. He was 23 years old. Thomas James Kellerman, TJK. 3 syllables, 2 syllables, 1 syllable. The obituary mentioned he'd been staying in the attic room while recovering from pneumonia. The same room where I was sleeping 70 years later. I went back through my grandmother's belongings with new purpose. Hidden in the bottom drawer of an antique desk, I found a leather-bound journal and what looked like a code book. Morse code with the alphabet and number patterns written in fading ink. That night, I waited. At 2:47 a.m., the knocking started. But this time, I listened differently. The patterns between the main sequence, the pauses weren't empty. They contained their own rhythm. Using my grandmother's Morse code book, I started translating. The first message I decoded was, "Here." The next night, "Lonely." Then, "Help me." The messages got more desperate. "Can't leave." "So cold." "Please." On the 4th night of translation, I did something I immediately regretted. I knocked back. 3 knocks, 2 knocks, 1 knock. The response was immediate and violent. Every wall in the attic erupted with knocking. The ceiling, the floor, even the window frame. A symphony of desperate hammering that seemed to shake the entire house. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it felt like the sound was coming from inside my skull. "Stop!" I shouted into the chaos. "Please, just stop." Silence. Then, in the familiar 3-2-1 pattern, one final message. "Thank you." I never heard the knocking again. But the next morning, while cleaning up books that had fallen from their shelves during the disturbance, I found loose floorboards near where the knocking always originated. Underneath was a small space, maybe 2 feet square. Inside was another journal, this one written in Thomas's handwriting. The final entry was dated December 14th, 1953, 1 day before he died. "The fever is getting worse. Mother doesn't know how bad it really is. I can hear her crying downstairs, thinking I can't hear her through the floorboards. I'm scared I won't get better this time. But if something happens to me, I want someone to know I was here. I want someone to remember my name." I kept that journal. Sometimes I read it on quiet nights, learning about a young man who died alone in the same room where I lived, whose only remaining family connection was the desperate knocking that had echoed through the walls for 70 years. Thomas James Kellerman isn't forgotten anymore. In the corner by the dormer window sat my grandmother's rocking chair. Victorian era, probably an antique even when she inherited it. Dark wood with intricate carvings, a faded floral cushion that still held the impression of her body after months of emptiness. I'd planned to move it downstairs once the main house was ready, but something about displacing it felt wrong. It belonged in that corner, positioned to catch the afternoon light and overlook the backyard where she used to watch birds at her feeders. The first time it moved, I assumed I'd bumped it without realizing. I came home from my part-time job at the hardware store to find it gently rocking, like someone had just gotten up and walked away. But as October turned into November, the pattern became undeniable. Every evening between 7 and 8 p.m., the chair would start rocking on its own. Always gentle at first, the kind of peaceful rhythm you'd use to soothe a baby or calm your nerves after a long day. The same time, my grandmother used to sit there with her evening tea, watching the sunset through the window. I called my mom in Portland to ask about grandmother's routines. "Oh yes, that was sacred time for her," Mom said. 7 o'clock tea in the attic. She said it was the only hour of the day that truly belonged to her, when she could think without interruption. She'd been doing it for decades, even after we all moved away. One particularly lonely evening in mid-November, I decided to join her. I made tea the way she used to, Earl Grey with honey and a splash of milk, and sat in the rocking chair just as the sun was setting behind the neighbor's oak tree. The moment I settled into the worn cushion, I felt it. Memories that weren't mine flooded through me like water through a broken dam. I saw the attic as it had been in the 1950s when it was a young couple's bedroom. My grandparents, newlyweds, painting the walls and arranging their first furniture. I felt my grandmother's joy when she discovered she was pregnant with my uncle. Her grief when she lost a baby nobody in the family had ever told me about. Her quiet satisfaction as she watched her children grow up in this house. Decades of emotions, experienced in the space of minutes, all filtered through the perspective of someone sitting in this exact chair, in this exact spot. When the visions ended, I was crying tears that felt both mine and hers. That night, the chair rocked more violently than before. Not the gentle, soothing motion of evening tea, but something agitated, distressed. It moved several inches across the floor, scraping against the old hardwood with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. I found my grandmother's medical records the next day while sorting through papers for the estate lawyer. The last year of her life had been difficult in ways our family hadn't fully understood. Early dementia, confusion, anxiety attacks that her doctor had described as severe agitation in the evening hours. Sundowner's syndrome, he'd called it. Late-day confusion and distress common in dementia patients. The rocking chair's violent movements matched the timeline perfectly. The same agitation, the same evening hours, the same desperate energy with nowhere to go. "I'm sorry, Grandma," I whispered to the empty room that night. "I'm sorry you were scared and confused and none of us understood what you were going through." At exactly 7:15 p.m., I felt someone sit down in the chair beside my bed. The familiar creaking of weight settling into old wood, followed by the gentle, peaceful rocking I remembered from childhood visits. A sound that meant safety, comfort, home. And then, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard her humming. The lullaby she used to sing when I was small and couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. A melody I hadn't heard in 15 years, but remembered every note of. From that night forward, I started joining her for evening tea. 7 o'clock sharp every single day. I'd sit on my bed with my cup while she rocked in her chair, and we'd watch the sunset together. Sometimes I'd tell her about my day, the progress on the house renovations, the job interviews I'd been going to in town. The violent rocking stopped completely. Now it was just the gentle, rhythmic motion of contentment. A grandmother watching over her grandchild in the house where 4 generations of our family had made their memories. Even after I moved downstairs, I kept that evening routine. Some traditions are too important to break, especially when they're shared with someone who's been waiting 70 years for a little company during the loneliest hour of the day. The dormer window in my grandmother's attic had the best view of the property, During the day, I could see the entire backyard, the neighbors' houses, even the edge of Minto Brown Park about a half-mile away through the trees. But at night, that same window became something else entirely. It started in my 7th month there, right after New Year's. I'd be lying in bed, reading or scrolling through my phone, when I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision. Something shifting in the darkness just beyond the glass. At first, I thought it was tree branches swaying in the wind. Oregon winters are stormy, and the neighbor's old maple cast strange shadows when car headlights swept across it. But the figure was too consistent to be branches, too purposeful to be shadows. Every night around midnight, someone would be standing at the very edge of our property line, right where the grass met the gravel driveway of the house behind us. Never moving, never walking away, just watching the attic window. I could never see them clearly when I looked directly. The moment I turned my head to focus, they'd fade back into the darkness like they'd never been there. But in my peripheral vision, the silhouette was unmistakably human. Tall, wearing what looked like a long coat, completely motionless. I mentioned it to our neighbor Carol while checking the mail one afternoon. "Oh, honey," she said, her face going pale. "You shouldn't be seeing anyone back there. The house behind you has been empty since 2003. She told me the story over coffee the next day. The Hendersons had lived there for 40 years. Quiet couple, kept to themselves mostly. But Mr. Henderson had developed some kind of obsession with watching the neighborhood, especially my grandmother's house. He'd stand in his yard at all hours, Carol said. Your grandmother complained about it several times. Said she felt like she was being watched whenever she was in the garden. Made her uncomfortable, you know. An old woman living alone. The obsession had gotten worse as Mr. Henderson aged. Dementia, Carol thought, though the family never talked about it openly. He'd stand outside in his bathrobe during winter storms, staring at my grandmother's attic window until his wife came to get him. After he died, the family couldn't sell the house fast enough. Said it had too many bad memories. They demolished it rather than deal with repairs. That night, I tried to photograph the figure with my phone. The camera app crashed. I borrowed a friend's digital camera the next night. It wouldn't turn on, even with fresh batteries. I bought a cheap disposable camera from the grocery store, and when I got the film developed, every photo showed nothing but empty darkness. But I kept seeing him. Every single night. Always in the same spot where his house used to stand. The sightings escalated over the next few weeks. Instead of just midnight, he'd be there in the afternoon when I got home from job. Interviews. Early morning when I had coffee by the window, always watching, always at the edge of perception. Then, one night in February, I woke up to the sound of tapping on glass. The figure was pressed against the outside of the attic window, not the vague silhouette I'd been seeing at a distance, but a clear human shape. Face against the glass, hands cupped around eyes to peer through. I couldn't make out features in the darkness, but I could see the impression of a nose, the outline of lips, the hollow spaces where eyes should be. We stared at each other for maybe 10 seconds. Him on the outside looking in, me frozen in bed looking back. Then a car turned the corner down the street, headlights sweeping across the yard, and he was gone. I found the newspaper clipping the next morning while going through my grandmother's collection of local news articles. Dated 2003, buried in a stack of garden club newsletters and church bulletins. Local man dies after extended illness. Harold Henderson, 73, passed away at home Tuesday after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. Neighbors remember him as a devoted husband who spent his final years confused but harmless, often standing in his yard, observing the changing neighborhood he'd called home for 4 decades. The article included a photo. Harold Henderson looked exactly like you'd expect a 73-year-old man to look, except for his eyes. Even in the grainy newspaper print, there was something intense about them. something that made you understand why my grandmother had felt watched, why the neighbors had been uncomfortable. I hung heavy curtains over the attic window that weekend, dark fabric that blocked out every trace of outside light. The feeling of being observed gradually faded over the following weeks. But sometimes, when I'm downstairs in the main house now, I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the backyard through the kitchen window. Just for a second, just at the edge of my vision. A tall figure in a long coat, standing where a house used to be, looking up at an attic window he can no longer see. Some obsessions, I think, outlast the people who carry them. After 8 months in the attic, the main house was finally ready. I'd spent every weekend and most evenings working on repairs, painting, updating electrical and plumbing. The insurance settlement from my grandmother's estate had covered the major renovations, and I'd found a decent job at a local engineering firm. It was time to move downstairs and start the next chapter of my life. But the attic didn't want me to leave. It started with small things. I'd pack a box of clothes, carry it downstairs to my new bedroom, and return to find the items scattered across the floor like someone had dumped them out. Books I'd shelved in the living room would appear back on the attic desk the next morning. My laptop kept moving itself back to the little table by the dormer window where I'd been working for months. I thought I was just being absent-minded, the stress of change making me forgetful. Moving is disorienting even under normal circumstances. But on my final night in the attic, everything that had happened over the past 8 months came back at once. The photographs scattered themselves across the floor in chronological order, including several I was certain I'd burned. The knocking started up again. Not just Thomas's 3-2-1 pattern, but responses from other areas of the room, like multiple people having conversation through the walls. My grandmother's rocking chair moved away from the window and positioned itself directly beside my bed, rocking rapidly with the agitated rhythm I remembered from her worst days. The temperature in the room dropped until I could see my breath, and the smell of old photographs and lavender perfume became overwhelming. At the window, backlit by moonlight, stood Harold Henderson. Not the vague silhouette I'd grown accustomed to, but a clear, solid figure. He raised one hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a handprint that fogged with impossible warmth. "I know you're all here," I said into the chaos, "and I know you don't want me to leave." The phenomena stopped immediately. Even the rocking chair went still. But I can't live up here forever. This house is my home now, not just a temporary place to stay. I'm not abandoning you. I sat up in bed and looked around the room that had been my entire world for 8 months. At the corner where Thomas had died, alone and scared. At the chair where my grandmother had spent her final coherent years, watching sunsets and remembering better times. At the window where Harold had watched our family for decades, even after death. "This will always be your space," I promised. "I'll keep it exactly as it is. I'll visit. Sunday evenings for tea with Grandma. I'll make sure Thomas isn't forgotten. And Harold, I'll leave the curtains open so you can keep watching if that's what you need." The temperature began to rise. The photographs faded away one by one, leaving only empty floor. The knocking settled into a gentle rhythm, not desperate communication, but acknowledgement. Goodbye. My grandmother's rocking chair gave 3 slow, deliberate rocks, then went completely still. At the window, Harold Henderson's handprint slowly disappeared from the glass. I moved downstairs the next morning without any further interference. The main house felt warm and welcoming, like it was ready for a new chapter too. But I kept my promise. Every Sunday evening I climb those narrow stairs to the attic. I sit on what used to be my bed and have tea while my grandmother rocks peacefully in her chair by the window. Sometimes I update Thomas on current events, tell him about the changes in Salem, the progress of technology he never got to see. I leave the curtains open so Harold can maintain his vigil over the neighborhood he never really left. It's been 3 years now, and I've never felt alone in this house. Not lonely, not scared, just accompanied. Like I'm part of something larger than myself. Something that goes back generations and forward into whatever comes next. The attic isn't haunted. It's home to family members who just needed someone to remember them, to acknowledge that they were here, that they mattered. Sometimes the most frightening thing about the dead isn't that they want to hurt us. It's that they want to be remembered, and sometimes, if you listen carefully and keep your promises, they'll let you know that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself across the years, in a house that holds the memories of everyone who ever called it home. Thanks for listening. If you made it through all 5 stories, you're braver than most. Sweet dreams.